Most people who are in the desert are not there because of a single tragedy. They are there because the tragedy has become a pattern. I remember waking up in the morning, not to the pain of a new day, but to the pain of a repeated day. The same guilt that suffocated me the night before, the same broken promise not to yield to addiction, the same feeling that grief was not a passage, but a circular prison. I wasn't just living in the past. The past was living me. This, the past's trap. It is not an external force. It is our own mind, conditioned by fear and the comfort of what is already known, pulling us back to the same fall. We believe that if we do the same things, at some point we will get a different result. But the repetition of suffering is, in fact, a form of denial. It is the way our ego finds to avoid the only thing that truly liberates us. Novelty. Novelty is the unknown, the incalculable. It is the leap of faith that takes us out of the cycle. But fear, fear. It convinces us that familiar suffering is safer than unknown joy. How many times have you promised yourself that this was the last fall? How many times have you sworn that tomorrow would be different, only to wake up and find that the walls of your cell, your destructive habits, were exactly the same? What holds us in this repetition is not a lack of willpower. It is a lack of courage to recognize that our way of thinking and acting is already addicted. We are trapped in a psychological time loop where the past is our only future. What if I told you that the strength to break this cycle is not in your effort to fight, but in your courage to let go of the repetition? If what you have heard so far has already made you thoughtful, stay with me to reflect on this and subscribe to the channel before you forget and miss the next voyages in philosophy. Repetition is often seen as the death of consciousness. The thinker Terence McKenna had an obsession with novelty. He argued that the history of the universe is not cyclical, but spiral, always moving toward greater complexity and novelty. For him, being trapped in repetition weather of destructive habits, social structures, or thought patterns was going against the very current of the cosmos and our soul, trapped in the desert, feels this paradox: your addiction, your prolonged grief, your recurrent anxiety are the manifestation of this repetition. It's your system saying, I can no longer process the pain, so I will shut down and return to the last known checkpoint, even if that checkpoint is destructive. When you find yourself in the same fall, again, you are not failing in your journey. You are just confirming that the system you built, that dominator ego from the previous video, is still trying to dictate time. It wants to keep you in the past because the past is predictable. The past is your comfort zone, even if it is a miserable comfort zone. Healing begins when you become an observer of your own repetition. You are not the fall. You are the consciousness that notices the fall. The calling to rebirth is not an invitation to be perfect. It is an invitation to be new, and being new requires courage. Not the courage of an action hero, but the quiet courage of a child who trusts the hand that lifts them up, even if that hand leads them down a path they have never seen. This courage breaks the time loop. It forces your consciousness toward the future, toward the novelty that divine grace always promises. No one leaves the vicious cycle through sheer willpower. They leave the cycle through the courage to give up the repetitive struggle and surrender to that which is greater and radically new. What truly defines an addiction or grief stuck in time is the absence of creativity. When we are in the repetition loop, the mind becomes sterile. You can only conceive of the next fall, the next day of despair, because your imagination is exhausted. You are using the language of your past to describe your future. McKenna, the seeker of the frontiers of consciousness, spent his life talking about language and the logos. For him, language was not just communication. It was the act of creation that lifted humanity from the animal state. And if repetition is death, the logos is continuous rebirth. In my journey in the desert, I understood this lesson in a way my dominator ego could never have grasped. Grace manifests as a new word that breaks the cycle. It is not the word of judgment that my past repeated, "You are a failure," but the word of God that is radically novelty, "You are loved, you are forgiven." This is the courage of novelty. It is having the audacity to believe in a word that contradicts all visible evidence of your life. The ego, trapped in the past's trap, hates novelty. Why? Because novelty is unpredictable. It demands that you discard your script of suffering and accept a plot that you did not write and cannot control. The ego only feels secure in the self-fulfilling prophecy of its own fall. It prefers known misery to the uncertain joy of surrender. When you allow yourself to hear the calling, the whisper of the logos you are, permitting a creative force greater than your own tragedy to enter your system and begin rewriting the code. The repetition of addiction cannot withstand a word that is pure creation. My prayer was, God, help me be stronger. That was the language of the dominator ego. The language of novelty is, Lord, I give up on being strong. I embrace your grace and your word, which is the only strength there is. The act of surrender is the act of allowing novelty. McKenna told us that history moves toward a point of infinitude of connections, of maximum complexity, of total surprise. For us, in the context of rebirth, that point is the total union with the Lord's presence. It's when your individual story stops being a predictable loop and becomes an ascending spiral of learning and transformation. The fight against repetition is primarily fought in our mind. The past's trap manifests as a vicious, internal dialogue, that lying mind that McKenna and the mystics always warned about. It has a limited script, and that script boils down to 2 sentences. You've failed before, and the future is the same as the past. The dominator ego operates by default. It requires no effort to pull you into the loop of addiction or grief. It only needs you to yield to inertia, to the lack of courage to think a new thought. The great leap of rebirth is the exchange of language. The Logos God's creative word enters your mind and gives you a language of novelty. This new language does not deny the suffering, but recontextualizes the pain. The lying mind says, I am in the desert because I am bad. The creating mind says, I am in the desert because he is realigning me for novelty. The courage of novelty thus becomes the act of actively choosing the language of the Logos in every single thought. This is difficult because the mind, addicted to repetition, fears transformation. If you truly change, who will you be? You will have to leave behind the identity of the addict, the incurable mourner, the chronic failure. The ego prefers the known destructive identity because at least it is an identity. Novelty is a void, a blank canvas that requires total surrender and faith that the Lord's presence will fill it. I found that to break the cycle, I needed to exit reaction mode and enter creation mode. Addiction, or the relapse of grief, always came from a reaction to a trigger: stress, loneliness, longing. I reacted to the trigger with the same repetitive, addicted behavior. The courage of novelty taught me to create a space between the trigger and the response. In that space, which lasts only a microsecond, resides all your power for rebirth. It is there that you have the chance to reject the language of the past and invoke the new word of the Logos. If the past's trap is a vicious cycle, the testimony is the escape hatch. It is the living evidence that the Logos, the creative and transforming word, more powerful than your history of repetition and fall. For too long, my dominator ego kept me in silence. It whispered, your pain is your failure. Keep it hidden to maintain your mask. It knew that secrecy was the key to the prison. Silence ensured that the cycle of addiction and grief would repeat endlessly, without the interruption of external novelty. The courage of novelty is not just about what you think, but about what you speak. The first time I used the language of novelty, broke the secrecy of my suffering, and confessed the truth about my vicious cycle was the moment the prison collapsed. Testimony, in this context, is the ultimate weapon against repetition. When you share your story, you pull it out of the past's trap and project it into the future as a map for the other. You stop being the victim of the cycle and become the narrator of your redemption. It is the final act of surrender to the greater purpose. I realized that the lying mind feared testimony because it exposes the lie of self-sufficiency. Testimony is essentially the public confession that grace is real, and that the strength to break the cycle came from outside of me. The true liberation from the vicious cycle is not the absence of temptation. It is the unwavering courage to use the temptation as an opportunity to witness the Lord's presence that is sustaining you now. At the exact moment you are about to fall, the power of the past's trap lies in its inertia. It is the force that tries to convince us that grace is not real, that rebirth is a mirage, and that the calling is just your own voice. But I discovered the plot twist of all the suffering of repetition. The addiction or grief loop only breaks when you stop fighting the symptom and start fighting the belief in repetition. You are not destined to live the same fall. The Logos is creative. God is novelty. And that novelty is waiting for your final act of courage. And what is that act? It is the surrender of all your old scripts. It is the courage to step out of the loop and say, I don't know what comes next, but I trust the Lord's presence to lead me to something that is entirely new. The true tragedy is not to fall. The true tragedy is to fall and, out of a lack of courage, to wait for the same repetitive action to lift you. Grace is available now, not tomorrow, and every second it invites you into a life you have never lived, a joy you have never felt, a strength that is not your own. Remember McKenna's wisdom: nature loves courage. The spiritual universe loves the courage of novelty. If you are currently trapped in the cycle, if your past is dictating your tomorrow, know that God's novelty begins with your decision to refuse the script. Your testimony of deliverance is waiting for you on the other side of your greatest inertia. I ask you, with the urgency of one who has seen the end of the cycle, what fundamentally new thing will you do today to prove that your faith is greater than your repetition?